Hello and welcome. Thank you all for coming along to the sixth in a series of disaster recovery conversations brought to you by the Victorian Council of Social Service. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from where I'm presenting, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and of course I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, which has generously provided the funding to allow this conversation to take place. I'd also like to introduce Amber Richardson and Brooke Tapia, who you'll see on your screens. They're our Auslan interpreters for today, and a big thank you to them for their work. Just a reminder that we are recording and will be transcribing today's conversation so that you can share it across your networks. And if you've got a question for any of our speakers, please submit them in the Q&A tab on your screen. I'm very excited about today's conversation. We're here to talk about the role of the arts and creativity in recovery. To open our conversation, I'm really thrilled to introduce to you Scotia Monkovitch. Scotia is the Executive Officer of the Creative Recovery Network. She has a performance background spanning 25 years in the arts, including theatre and performance, and Scotia also has a broad range of professional experiences in the community arts and cultural development sector, and these have taken her right throughout Australia and internationally. Scotia has diverse experience in training, mentoring, strategic planning, project management, research and facilitation of community cultural development programs and strategies. We're really lucky to have Scotia with us today. Can't wait to hear from you, Scotia. Welcome. We just can't quite hear Scotia.
Thanks, Bridget. And hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to come and speak with you today. I'm calling in from Meanjin, Brisbane, the land of the Yagara and Turrbal people. It's been a very beautiful day. So I've got strawberry blonde hair. I'm wearing bright blue glasses today, and I have a black jacket with my little favourite brooch, which is Dark Angel. So Creative Recovery Network is an advocacy body that's grown out of a lot of experience across Australia in terms of the support and the need and the activation of culture and the arts within the disaster management sector. And I thought we'd start today by introducing the work really through the work itself with a small little overview video that we have. So we might play that now. Thanks, Karen. Well, that what we just saw was a kind of overview of a lot of projects from across Australia, quite a few of them from Victoria and internationally. And in a sense, what we're trying to give you a picture of in that is the diversity and the ways and means of how culture and the arts can be activated, and is really a strong part of how communities connect and make meaning and sense with each other. We enable the capacity to create safe spaces and inclusive ways of looking at self-determination, particularly in recovery, but more particularly, I think one of the strong ways that we are trying to advocate into the sector, and particularly at a strategic and a planning level, is that we can play such a strong role in the preparedness space for communities. How are we looking at building connected and stronger communities into what is going to be a very, very challenging future? Or we're living it now, really, in terms of the climate crisis that we are all contending with. So you're going to be hearing from a range of different practitioners and organisations today, but we are here to support, to advocate. We have a strong raft of training in Creative Recovery Network, so there's a lot of expectations for people to come into what is really a trauma process and a practice without necessarily understanding a clear frame of reference, so that we realise there was a gap, certainly in the arts. So our training is trying to ensure that we have a trauma-informed process with our artists. They're given clear mentoring and support, and that we have a professional supervision process around them so that they are working in safe ways and also looking after themselves. And we're working with a range of different task force and roundtables at state and federal level to try and ensure that the voice of the arts and culture contingency is in at instrumental times to influence the way that we might perhaps proceed in terms of ensuring that communities are making choices for themselves. They're doing it with a broad raft of tools and information to be able to show that there's a variety of different ways of how they could be engaging and planning collectively. So I'm very happy to respond, perhaps at the end, Bridget, when we've seen the other work, so that we can have a sense of where we can take these sort of processes and programs that you're about to hear into the future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Scotia. I found that video itself to be quite a journey and so evocative. And it took me back to periods in my life where, I read about and heard through the media, these various emergencies and disasters, and to see them expressed in that way, and in the various different ways, using all those different mediums and approaches, was really quite extraordinary. I've got just a couple of questions that have come through, if you're happy to answer them, Scotia. And one of them is, tell us about some of the art projects that community members have produced that have really stuck with you, the ones that have really impacted you personally.
Well, that's a really massive question, because there are so many, actually. And in some ways, I'm not necessarily personally connected to a lot of them. Like we work to support, we don't necessarily drive projects. But I can talk to one that we did very early on. The Creative Recovery Network came out of a big piece of applied research that was occurring in Queensland after the 2011 floods. And that's where we began to kind of make connections and identify gaps of need, particularly in the arts, in around supporting artists, but more particularly seeing so much opportunity for us to play a really activated, engaged role within disaster and emergency management. And there was one project we were working in across a range of different primary schools, because we identified that there was a lot of ongoing concern around how to care for carers, and that meant teachers, it meant community leaders, but it also in a family, it meant their parents, and there was a real disconnect between sharing a responsibility of recovery between parents and children. And as we all know, and a lot of the people who would be on the call with us today working with the outcome of that, which was often increased domestic violence and a disconnect around stress and management of family relationships. So we work with young children across 3 schools in this community that was very deeply impacted by those floods and had identified increased domestic violence issues. And we went through a whole raft of programs with those young people about how to understand care and how to give care and how to kind of take on some leadership in their position in their community, in their families. So they learned a whole lot of skills around massage and essential oils and things to release tension, like juggling and writing and yoga and a whole raft of different processes, as well as working with some healthcare workers around stress mediation. And so at the end of all of that, they then presented a series of care days for their parents and their teachers. So they took on a real leadership role in terms of then caring in a very physical and emotional way to the parents and teachers of those school communities over a series of engagement days that the school then hosted. So, and the exchange from that was just, to me, extraordinary. It's this whole sense of turning on the head the notion of leadership from some giving young people a real platform to have their voice and their needs heard, but then to take on a driving role in terms of how they would translate that into how they would then work with adults. So that was a really extraordinary project to be part of.
That does sound extraordinary, and how empowering for those children and young people to have that experience and have that experience through creativity, which they're so inherently good at. Every time they step out into the playground or do anything, they're naturally being creative. It's fabulous.
Yeah, the flow on for the school has been an establishment of an ongoing program around that kind of exchange process with parents. So, its legacy still lives on, which is great to know.
Yeah, absolutely, and working to strengthen families and communities as well. The other question that's come through is around your work with people with a disability, and we know that right across the emergency management cycle, people with a disability aren't really considered and have been neglected for quite some time, although that is changing in a number of jurisdictions. I'm really interested in your work with people with a disability and any reflections you can share.
To be honest, we are involved in a range of discussions groups. We're not leading any direct project work at the moment. I mean, I could have mentioned, I know that the arts platform has been used to raise a lot of issues that have been experienced by people with disabilities. So, for example, in Lismore, after the last floods, I think that was 2017, what came to light from that was a whole range of the deaf community were totally isolated in quite traumatic flood scenarios. And so what occurred then was a kind of a performance ritual program that then they worked with the local community to present as part of a public expose and a public storying of the experience of what they felt, the emotive as well as the kind of realistic frame of neglect in a sense that occurred because the information wasn't shared effectively with those communities and they didn't know what was going on because they hadn't had any capacity to hear any of the news. So, I mean, there's a range of projects I can point to that have worked to be an advocacy tool for people with a lived experience of disabilities in a range of capacities. We would be really excited to hear about how we could work more in that space. We're part of the Diversity Hub and a few other platforms that are trying to address that. We know it's a real concern. So whoever put that question forward, I'd love to hear from you and to work more effectively in partnership around that.
That's fantastic, Scotia. I know there'll be people on this call that will be interested, so you can expect a few emails, I think, to come pinging into your inbox.
Disability Arts Australia, I think it's Arts Access Australia, is just about to start an investigation program around how to work more effectively within a disability framework, and they have asked us to be part of that. So again, that could be something that we could really feed in into as it's evolving. It's just about to be rolled out across Australia. So that's one kind of interesting, exciting place where the arts are leading in terms of some sort of benchmark of good practice. So we're looking forward to see where that goes.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. Scotia, thank you so much. I hope to see you at the end of the conversation where we can pose some more questions to you and the other speakers. And thank you again for sharing that video. It was really powerful, and I, for one, feel quite moved. Really appreciate it. So thank you. So coming up to our next speaker is Jo Toohey. Jo is currently the Executive Director at Regional Arts Victoria, which is a not-for-profit arts company which inspires arts across the state. Jo's also a board member at the Footscray Community Arts Centre, was previously CEO of Express Media, worked at Victoria University, and for some time was a youth services officer at Banyule City Council for their Freezer Youth Music and Cultural Music Events program. Jo's also been a volunteer, board member and presenter and executive producer at the Student Youth Network. So I think we get a real sense here that Jo's very experienced and passionate around creating opportunities for artists, media makers and young people. Welcome, Jo.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for taking time out of your afternoon to come and be part of this conversation with us. That was a wonderful introduction. Thank you. My name's Jo. I am the Executive Director at Regional Arts Victoria. I am joining you remotely today from the lands of the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation. I extend my respects to their elders past, present, and to any of those who might be joining us from wherever you are across the state today. Also want to note that I know there's a number of Regional Arts Victoria team members who are working directly in some recovery, including bushfire recovery spaces at the moment, and thank them for their incredible ongoing work. I also just wanted to flag some of the stuff that I'm going to cover today and that we're covering today in this session may bring up some uncomfortable or traumatic memories or experiences for you. So I just wanted to make it clear that I can't see if you have to leave the session and won't be offended at all if you need to take time for yourself from this session if these discussions bring up any of that for you. Of course, I can't see you anyway, so if you leave because I'm just really boring as well, my only ask is that you please come back in 15 minutes to hear all the other amazing speakers on for the rest of the day. Regional Arts Victoria, as you would have heard, is a not-for-profit membership arts organisation. We do more or less what it sounds like the name suggests. We support artists and communities across regional Victoria to participate in and experience creative work. In 2009, it was actually Monday, February 9, 2009. I was working at Regional Arts Victoria and I came into the office that Monday and I sat down on my desk and turned the computer on, it being the Monday after the Black Saturday bushfires in Victoria. And turning my computer on was the easy bit, right? It was figuring out what to do next that was really quite difficult, more specifically from where I was sitting at Regional Arts Victoria. When you're working with a community or group of communities that many of whom had lost everything on Black Saturday, when they've lost everything, can arts offer them anything? And it turned out, as was one of the great professional experiences of my life, it turns out that the arts can actually offer quite a lot. In the years since 2009, we've seen artists contribute to community recovery in all sorts of different forms. So musicians running fundraisers, painters designing murals, sculptures who are running community workshops, blacksmiths building trees, mosaic artists who are rebuilding letterboxes, jewellers creating protection boxes for memories, performers trusted with the retelling of stories, poets who find the words that we can't, and of course filmmakers who have the capacity to see maybe what we didn't. After the 2009 fires and some of the work that we did there, you might have seen in the newsletter that accompanied this this session, there was an evaluation commissioned by then Arts Victoria, evaluating some of the work that Regional Arts Victoria had done. And one of the things it was asked to examine was the value of arts in disaster recovery spaces. And it was clear through some of the programs that I'll talk about in just a minute that were happening then, just what kind of role the arts can play in that community recovery space. So some of the things that report found, and you can read this, there is a link in it in that newsletter, you can read a bit more about it in your own time. But there was a role that the arts and creative practice was playing in building and rebuilding communities, so helping people to create new connections when some old ones had perhaps been severed. There was a process where the arts could assist in creating memorials and memories through either sculpture or other creative projects that might help memorialise what had happened during that disaster. There was an obvious role for the arts and creative sector to play in sharing of stories and providing stories in people's own time. A really interesting find that arts projects allowed people to give. So there was a lot of people in the community and outside the community who were really keen to contribute in some way, and arts projects that brought people together gave them an opportunity to contribute something to that recovery process. There's a lot of research about the improvement of particularly mental health outcomes as a result of participating in creative that was found through that program as well. And a really important one, as many people who are watching this will know, is that sometimes those creative projects can bring a bit of order from disorder. So at a time when everything in your life might have been turned upon its head, the opportunity to meet really regularly, establish a routine, work on something, and work on that sense of mastery on something in a creative sense was a really important outcome for a lot of people who were participating in those programs. This project here, or this photo, is from a project called Illuminated by Fire, which I'll talk about in just a moment. Because what we have discovered since 2009 and some of the work that Regional Arts Victoria has done from that point on has understanding, and now that we know and we take as given that the arts have a role to play in that recovery process, what are some of the things that we can put in place to make sure that there are opportunities for that to occur? So some of the programs that we've run to put that support in place have been around offering small quick response grants, such as those following the 2009 fires. In all of the grant programs that we offer in our recovery programs now, we are very careful to support people around it. Not just, I know a lot of the feedback around recovery grants programs is to make the program as simple as possible, but we also know that the most simple things can become incredibly difficult when you're recovering from a traumatic experience. So in addition to making processes simple, employing people on the ground or providing support to people on the ground to help people access those resources when they were there has become a core part of any recovery work that we deliver, particularly in the short to medium term. We've offered those kind of small grants programs after 2009 and after the 1920 fires, in 2013, 14, and also recently and in 2009. We've also had people on the ground whose role has been to support people through that recovery process. In 2010-11, after the 2009 fires, about 18 months after, we also delivered a project which was more of a long-term legacy focus, which was called Illuminated by Fire, where we worked with 11 communities across the entire state, not just those who had been most recently impacted by fires, to use the arts to start a conversation about the reality of living with fire in Victoria. Because, of course, there is a very strong and very devastating impact that bushfire can have. But there are also roles that fire plays in cooking, as an example. There are roles that fire plays in smoking ceremonies for our First Nations communities. It is a complex relationship that we have with fire, and it is a real one that we need to evaluate and assess. So that project worked with 11 communities and 11 different artists to talk about what it meant, a different aspect about what it meant to live with fire in Victoria, and helped those communities have those conversations. Scotia's mentioned the training programs that the Creative Recovery Network provide. We also consider that a really important legacy outcome of recent programs that we're seeking to be part of, where artists in particular are given the skills that they need to work with trauma impacted communities. They're not just thrown in the deep end as artists, but given some additional skills to support that work that they might be doing. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. From Regional Arts Victoria, we're an arts organisation, so that there is really two critical things that we focus on. Those when we talk about creative recovery. The first of those is the recovery of creatives themselves. So artists who are living in those communities, who themselves have experienced trauma or lost property, maybe even tragically lost loved ones. What support do they need as part of the creative recovery process? And then, of course, what is the main topic of conversation today is what role can the creatives play in aiding the wider community recovery? We tend to focus a lot on that second one, on what role the arts and creatives can play in assisting with that community recovery process, everything from mental health to economic regeneration and attracting more visitors to those examples I gave before. I just flagged that here because a lot of the programs that we do are also small grants to help people replace lost equipment or to hire out or find spaces where they can and refine their practice or take on some additional training if they need to shift into a new area of practice, if they want to take that opportunity to do that. And I also say it because it's important to note that in addition to potentially offering some support work to the wider community through their creative practice, those artists themselves are often going through that same process as everyone else as part of their recovery. Since the COVID-19 pandemic last year, we've started to organise what we consider, using some terminology developed by our national body, Regional Arts Australia, we've started to organise that recovery process into 3 overlapping phases. They're not completely neat, but they give a good indication of what we think are the useful starting points. The first immediate phase is around relief. So small grants, it's around on-the-ground support and just getting, without getting in the way of people who are dealing with a range of challenges, figuring out what some of the immediate needs of both creatives and creative recovery be. That develops into a more medium-term, what we call a recovery approach, where the on-the-ground support continues, but perhaps there's capacity for some larger community recovery projects like festivals, like bigger events, because people have started to address some of those more immediate concerns around finding at least some kind of temporary shelter in the instance of a fire or a flood, for example. That then evolves into the renewal phase, which is very much on that of those 2 creative recovery components I talked about before, about how do we build longer legacy training programs. So what are some of the things that creatives can do to help that community recover and perhaps even reimagine what it is and how it works? A final comment I just wanted to reflect upon was some of the advocacy challenges, I guess, that we find in this space as far as creative recovery is concerned, which you might find to be true as well. We know that given the Black Saturday examples, we were still doing work on a project in Kinglake, which was a Black Saturday impacted community earlier this year, well over 10 years on. So it's a very long-term process. A lot of the time, though, the resourcing and I guess political interest in those efforts only happens immediately after the disaster. So trying to balance what we know is a long-term challenge with, I guess, what tends to be a political reality of a short-term reactive fix. And just the final one is our former chair, who was the Emergency Services Commissioner at the time of Black Saturday, Bruce Esplin, talks a lot about our tendencies to forget. So this idea that each time one of these disasters hits, we often treat it like it's the first time it's happened. And there is learning that we can do as individuals and organisations and communities that is important to be building upon, so that each time things come around again, we have those, as that note says there, we've established what some of the priorities will be and also have a sense about what we might need to do to get us through the next little phase. My contact details are there if you're interested in talking about these further, and thanks again for having me.
Thank you so much, Joe. That was an amazing overview of what has been obviously an incredible amount of work by Regional Arts Victoria, and by extension all of the artists and communities that have played a part through your grants opportunities and others. Joe, do you have any advice for community organisations, for people that might not be familiar with the arts world or might not know an artist per se, about how to encourage creativity in their communities?
Yeah, most of you will know an artist, or you will know somebody creative. I mean, you take a wide lens of what you consider the arts as well. Remember, we're talking about writers and musicians, and not just visual artists. That there are people who are really good at this stuff and really excited and keen to help. And remember that there are, you'll have a local paper or a local radio station where these things are often, even community radio station where these things are broadcast and shared all the time. And find those people who have that. If you're intimidated by that, or you don't feel that you can approach that a creative program, find the people that can and invite them into the tent. I mean, those artists love being involved in those conversations from the outset, because often they kind of get brought in right at the end when most of the program's already been designed to play their guitar in the corner. You know, these are human beings with lots of things to offer, as well as their creative skills. So that would be my advice: is that call upon those people you know, and you'll be surprised how many people can be brought into the conversation from there.
That fantastic advice. And lastly, just thinking about young people, I guess, which I know is one of your passions, and thinking about young people, creativity, their future, climate change, dealing with future emergencies and disasters. What are your thoughts there?
Occasionally, my thoughts are a little despondent, to be honest. It feels like there's a thing that's going to be inflicted upon the next generation of people that is not of their doing, but will be of theirs to deal with it and trying to fix. And I think it is a reality that a changing climate is going to change the way that we have to approach creative practice. In the same way that we have to change the way we approach many things in our community. But if I put that rather bleak part of the assessment aside, working with young people and all my experience with doing it has the first thing to overcome is this idea of this misunderstanding of what we mean when we talk about experience. I think we equate years of life with experience, whereas experience in a particular thing is actually a much more lightly defined thing. So if I'm talking about a musician who's maybe 12, they've still got more experience being a musician than me at 36 years old, because of the time that they've had experience in that practice, and that works across the board. So bringing young people into leadership positions where you value their experience, not just as people who you consult with in the design of or adjustment of existing programs, but all the ones that I've seen succeed have been at places like SYN Radio and Express Media, where the editorial and creative decisions were made by young people. They did the broadcasting, they did the writing, they did the publishing. So you put, of course, whatever safety and legal and other support you need around that. But the creative outcomes and leadership decisions, always, I will say, that you give those young people in your community the chance to do that. I've just never been disappointed. It's always been a positive experience for me. So I will always wholeheartedly advocate for that young leadership and young creative leadership as an important way to attack some of those problems.
Wholeheartedly agree. Young people are where it's at, and I always come away so energised and inspired when I work with young people. Joe, thank you so much. Really look forward to chatting with you at the end of the conversation today. I'm going to introduce our next speakers. We have Robin Bryant and Padma Newsome. Robin is president of the Malakuta Community Health Infrastructure and Resilience Fund. Robin has a long and interesting past prior to retiring in Malakuta and getting themselves deeply involved in the community there. Padma Newsome is an Australian composer, arranger, and performer who is based in Malakuta. I'm really looking forward to hearing what they've got to say, so I'll pass over to them now. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Bridget. I'll kick off. Do you want to say hello, Padma?
Hello, how are you? Just like to, if it's okay, pay respects to the people of the land and the sea in Malakuta, Bidwal Marp, Ewan, Monero, and thank you.
So, like Scotia, I'm actually in the Turrbal and Yugara area in Brisbane, the home of the next Olympics in 2032. And I live in the Kurilpa area, which is, that means water rat. And you can see in the background my banjo. I'm a water rat everywhere I go when you pull out your banjo. 2002, I achieved my dream and retired and bought a house in Mallacoota with my wife, and we lived there part-time and then full-time. And of course, 2003, the Canberra bushfires, we were right in the middle of that, right at the very front. We went right through it, and I thought I had lost Andra at one stage. It gave me a real sense of what recovery is all about, as we had to live with that for a very long time. Houses went down all around us. In 2016, my doctor in Malakuta approached me, said, we need help, the medical practice is about to close. We had a community meeting, many of you will have seen us on back roads, and we decided that we needed to find doctors and try and build up the medical services in Malakuta. That's the genesis of the formation of CHIRF, Malakuta Community Health Infrastructure and Resilience Fund. And in the time since, we found another doctor. It took us 2 years going to medical conferences. We built a new medical practice. We've introduced new medical services by finding grants, and particularly with the substantial and unrelenting support from the FRRR, Foundation of Rural and Regional Renewal, most rural empathetic organisation I've ever come across. And we have a teen clinic, we have a chronic rehabilitation program, we have 2 psychs, mental health worker, and of course we have 2 doctors. CHIRF now has 12 people on their books providing services. In 2019, I was in Brisbane. I had been in the CFA and I saw what was happening. And with my friends down in Can River, we followed the fires and we had a pretty good idea. I was running Malakuta Community News with a couple of my friends, the Facebook page, which became the key vehicle for communication. And it provided the community with a sense of awareness as to what was happening with the fire. In 2002, and I'll just go back a little bit, when I first went there, I joined the Strum Club. I took my banjo and I went along. I discovered many jokes about banjo players, but it taught me about patience, it taught me about friendship, and it showed me very much what a remote community is like and how you build up networks right around of all age groups. It was a wonderful experience and it changed my views about music forever. Coming forward to 2019, the fires happened. It was a disaster. We were in tears. I was following it very closely, in considerable contact with the doctors in the medical centre and so on. I knew exactly what was going on, and we had the Canberra experience to follow us through. The lockdown, the real lockdown, we couldn't get back in until the middle of February. It was devastating. And when I finally got in, almost the first person I ran across was Padma. And we have a wonderful relationship over time, and we have some very good, serious arguments. And one of the arguments we had this time was about the role of music in creating recovery within our community. So we challenged each other. He challenged me to find the money. I challenged him to come together with a program. Together with CHIRF, providing total support, we approached FRRR and the News Corp, and they gave us some money to provide a program called Ashes to Music, which Padma will very quickly will take you through. To me, it was an achievement of a dream to be able to bring to my community, and I will just remind people, Malakuta is a very remote, it's the most remote town in Victoria, 200,000 hectares of bush, of forest around it, almost all now burnt out. It has 1,000 people in it. Over 50% of those people are over 60. By now, I calculate there are 253 people over 75. And if you think about the mean death age, you can know what people of my age, which is where I fit, are thinking about our future. And most of those people have had some association with music. And we also have within our community professional musicians like Padma and so on. So a lot of them lost instruments. So as part of our program, we tried to find instruments for them. Padma, would you like to take people through what you created on the back of my arguments?
Well, I'll have a go. Thanks, Robin. I've actually written a whole bunch of copy and I may not get through it, so excuse me. So we developed the Ashes to Music program in the aftermath of the New Year Eve firestorm. And I'm going to frame this discussion with the following lenses or contexts. The first being well-being and health. The second being post-disaster social and cultural disruption, continuity and adaptation, and simply making art and making art with community. In June of 2020 last year, Robin and I applied for and were pleased to receive a News Corps Foundation for Rural and Regional Renewal grant towards creative recovery. We had a simple idea, bringing people together through the sharing and making of art. We called it Ashes to Music. All activities are free, access is open to all. We're currently delivering Beach Uke at Bastion Point and its adaptive variants, choir at Malakuta P12 College, dance with choir at Malakuta P12 College, dance at kindergarten, music at kindergarten, beach fiddle at Bastion Point and adaptive variants, beach family for family members with children and Zooming and home visits. Tuesdays, music at the shed with Rosemary, open music sharing session. And we cover the following instrument share making: mandolin, guitar, uke, percussion, drumming, voice, songwriting, piano, violin, harmonica, recorder, composition, music theory, recording, music technology, stage sound, and more. We also curate workshops and are involved in community concerts. Two workshops that we've been working on are one with the Melbourne Chamber Orchestra, which I'll discuss a little bit later, and the other one, which is coming up soon, is the Melbourne Symphony. We're curating 3 visits to the kindergarten, the school, and Miva. Making and sharing music is very natural. It's cultural, social, emotional, spiritual, intellectual. Sorry about that. Visceral and lovely. It forms relationships and networks, internal and external. It is a multimodal expressional platform. But we were not making music at Malakuta, a community in recovery from the effects of the fire. And also, we were having the effects of the long-term shutdown. The old routes were unavailable, places to meet inaccessible, social groups disrupted. It was very hard to reach out to others. But art and music can be therapeutic without necessarily being therapy. Simply people with people and people with people making art. From January 2020, I was looking into historical arts disaster responses with co-researcher Susanna Keebler, and we've been able to develop a set of guidelines, ethics, and behavioural lenses through which I've been guided and informed. When relating to myself, self-care, look after myself, self-practice, make sure that I'm practicing my music and my research according to my own needs. And also make sure I'm trying to make research-based decisions, not just gut research. When relating to community, I'm looking to autonomy, self-design, duty of care, agency, respect. What's past? What's next? Skill-based delivery. I'm looking to pause before I invent the creative space. I'm looking to pause before I enter the creative space, and pause before creating a space and inviting others into it. A few practical ideas: make it free, make the music easy, regular, interactive, and fun. Beach Uke, which is our primary pilot project, now has a repertoire of more than 40 songs. It and the Malakuta Instrument Commons, which I'll talk about in a moment, build on what has come before, community entities such as Strum Club, our organic way of making music, of sharing, and the many other creative activities in town. Whoops. Hold on. I need to change. So it's all right. In addition, I've got to change the photo. In addition to the development of the ShareMake programs, I suggested also we develop the Malakuta Instrument Commons. Arts triage concerns immediate aftermath resource provision and looks towards places of art making and the resources needed to make art. The Malakuta Instrument Commons curates over 40 instruments and equipment. To date, we have provided over 30 instruments to individuals and households: guitars, ukuleles, violins, organs, keyboards, congas, bongos, saxophone, harmonicas, public announcement and projection gear, live stage gear, and the Martin Heritage collection of violins and bows. This collection includes the French violin, which we are now looking at, which by miracle survived the fire, and which story has personal and shared historic resonances in our town. In June, Robin communicated to me an interest in starting a ukulele group. Teaching, sharing and music making, we decided to try Beach Uke at Bastion Point, which is where this picture is. That's Robin speaking to Pam. It had a lot of things going for it, which is why I went for it. Firstly, the idea hadn't come from me, it had come from outside. It looked like it had the potential for innovation. Numbers would have a critical mass, which is about 5 or 6 in Malakuta. And there was a strong committed group who understood that it was a pilot project and were going to be health aware. We were reclaiming this beach as a people space. And you can see the fire damage around us. It was a lovely energy change, and after the fire, the beach had become a family beach, a natural space for people to hang out. We joined this organic movement. Here's me designing, measuring up the 4-metre squares, worrying whether someone's going to come or not. And here we are gathered. The primary problems were adaptation to ongoing CV-19 changes, the weather and the ability to hear properly. We brought a small PA to solve this latter problem, and we developed a strong set of CV-19 working principles adaptable to the changing ongoing regulations. As the year progressed, I would draw models and send them to Dr. Sarah Renwick-Lau through Robin for ratification. Without this connection, we wouldn't have been able to proceed. That's what we were looking at when we made music. Adaptation and resilience continue to be an important pillar of our program design, in particular applicable to Beach Fiddle and Beach Uke. Beach Fiddle utilised 6 adaptive delivery models. Similarly, Beach Uke has utilised 4 adaptive models. It should be mentioned that Beach Uke in itself is an adaptation, with multiple smaller adaptations associated with it: masks, sanitizer, having an observer, no sharing music, no singing, no mingling, and sonic and weather considerations. This was our first and most important indication that practicing art and sharing in community was going to require thought and persistence. And I'd like to Robin to introduce a video that we made showing showing
So
some of our work.
one of our professional musicians, Kristen Rule, a cellist of some renown, makes beautiful music, is also in love with her video camera, and she makes very professional videos. The Beach Uke gave her an opportunity as part of her recovery process to create a video that explained what we were doing and how we felt about it. And you will see in this video, which I think we could start in a couple of seconds, that it exemplifies exactly what we've got. And I'll just remind you, in the background, that is fire-burnt landscape. The fire came down to that point. And that is just next. Part of the sites that you will see is Bastion Point, where you saw HMAS Chul off the shore, and all of the Navy personnel and Army personnel bringing equipment and so on into the town. So it's very iconic. It's a very well-known place in Malakuta. But this music really grabs me, and I must admit, every time I listen, I burst into tears. Kieran? I think it's up to Kieran to push the button, or are you going to push it, Padma?
I don't have it here. They've got it.
Right. Right. Okay. So perhaps I could just.
Okay, all right.
Well, no. I think I should just say that it's a very difficult situation in remote communities like Malakuta with the age profile and demography that we have. And the challenges that Padma faces is bringing old people together and young people. Old people who are probably a little bit set in their ways, but equally are very keen to pick up an instrument and use it. But they don't necessarily want to become a professional or whatever. They want to get some enjoyment out of it. And Padma has become very skilled at bringing that together, getting people to enjoy the music, not only what's being played, but doing it themselves. And part of, I think, that the recovery process is people actually being able to pick up the banjo, which you see in the background, and simply tinker away and do something with it. And to create that opportunity in Malakuta at the time I was there was important. Go for it.
The moon pulls the tides, the tides rise and fall, the winds lift and carry the birds, the grasses rustle. Country is listening. We wait and listen too, but bring back the knowledge of the way things were before. They tell us how we can be. They tell us how we can be. They tell us how we can be together.
Good. Well, thank you very much. I think we've run out of our time. Is that correct? And so, yeah, is that correct? We've run out of time?
Yes, that's so sadly true, I'm afraid,
Okay,
Padma
good.
and Robin.
That's
Thank
all right.
you both so much, and what a beautiful video and song to end on. That was really quite haunting. And I can't help but reflect on, really how powerful music is in storytelling and sharing experiences. Kids in the playground are still singing Ring a Ring a Rosie, 450 years after a major global event. And let's hope that some of the music from Malakuta lives on in the playgrounds of kids across Victoria and beyond. Really fantastic work. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you.
Could I just quickly comment that in July, June the 11th, Padma had the Melbourne Chamber Orchestra down, and they played music that Padma and his children had created. 3 of Australia's top musicians playing our music. It was a wonderful session. It's something that we had to cut out, but I'd just like to mention that a 7-year-old created music that those 3 musicians played. It was unbelievable.
What a wonderful experience. It's given me goosebumps just thinking about it, and I only wish I could have been there. Damn COVID again. We are going to take a short break. I'd encourage you to stretch your legs, grab a cuppa, grab a glass of wine, grab a glass of water. We'll be back in about 5 minutes with our final speaker, Emily Sexton from Arts House. We'll see you all soon.
We have reached deeply to find the best and draw it up. And now we need to reach again, deeper. We have been born for this, designed for times like these, and we're remembering the wealth and wisdom of the old ways. I'm gonna draw it up, call it in, sing it out in my word. I'm gonna draw it up, call it in, sing it out in my word. I'm gonna draw it up, call it in, sing it out in my word. I'm gonna draw it up, call it in, sing it out in my word. Everything is different, something new at every turn. And while it's hard, the gold is here in this dark place. We may be stronger now, and we've had this time to breathe, and we're dreaming of the river of life flowing from this time. I'm gonna draw it up, call it in, sing it out in my word. I'm gonna draw it up, call it in, sing it out in my word. I'm gonna draw it up, call it in, sing it out in my word. I'm gonna draw it up, call it in, sing it out in my word. I'm gonna draw it up, me to reach again deeper.
Welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. That was from a bushfire relief concert that was held last year, and what a fabulously talented group of people doing fabulous things online. I just wanted to reflect on Robin and Padma's presentation and the work that they're doing. It really indicates to me the power of community and the power of community members really playing on their strengths, quite literally playing on their strengths, to produce great things for their community, to bring their communities together, to strengthen their communities and to support one another through their recovery journeys. I'm very pleased to introduce our last speaker, Emily Sexton. Emily is Artistic Director of Arts House. She's also a curator who's held multiple and significant creative roles in Melbourne, including Artistic Director of Next Wave, creative producer of Melbourne Fringe, and most recently head of programming for the Wheeler Centre for Books, Writing and Ideas. We're really lucky to have Emily with us today to tell us a little bit more about Arts House. I know many of the people who registered and attend today will be familiar with Arts House and the amazing work that it did as part of its refuge program, and we're really keen for you to tell us a bit more. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you. And what a pleasure it has been to hear these amazing projects. I don't think there's any doubt you can see the power of creativity and culture to lead us through preparedness and recovery. So thank you to all the other panellists. And I am currently on the lands of the Wurundjeri and the Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin Nation. I'd like to also contribute my respect to their elders, but I'd also like to acknowledge the many elders that form a very significant role in our work at Arts House, and particularly on our work through Refuge. So I'd like to extend my respect to Ngawi Carolyn Briggs, to Uncle Larry Walsh, and to Auntie Joy Wandam Murphy. So I'm going to play a video in a minute, but I just wanted to briefly introduce it. As mentioned, Arts House is a key program of the City of Melbourne and Melbourne's Centre for Contemporary Performance. And in our programming, we advocate for the role that artists can play in imagining new futures for the city. And we think about where civic responsibility and the arts collide. We've been thinking very deeply about those questions in a project called Refuge since 2016. And it was it became a 6-year project focused on community preparedness for climate change disaster. I guess one of the main strengths of Refuge is how it was co-designed by people who don't normally collaborate in a crisis, and that in ways that Scotia has mentioned, in ways that Joe has mentioned. But there were a really broad and important set of partners involved in Refuge. That include Emergency Management Victoria, SES, the Red Cross, Resilient Melbourne, University of Melbourne, North Melbourne Language and Learning, the Victorian Aboriginal Council of Languages, and many others. So I'd like to now share a video. It goes back to 2018 when Refuge looked at community preparation for pandemics. After the video, because it is a bit old, I'll share a few thoughts on our program, on the Refuge program since then, and also some of our early observations about the result of 6 years of this project. So if we can go into the video now, that'd be great.
Arts House is Melbourne's Centre for Contemporary Performance. Since 2016, one of our major pieces of work has been Refuge. It's a 5-year project that drops audiences in the hot zone of different climate change emergencies. Through a program of new art, Refuge offers our local community the chance to probe their own response to climate change catastrophe. In 2016, we imagined a local flood and transformed our venue, North Melbourne Town Hall, into a relief centre for 24 hours.
One of the things I really found was there was a number of local community members that were absolutely passionate about North Melbourne, about their community and about the things that matter to them, and they've used those that are passionate about what arts mean in North Melbourne to bring it together, which means it's got that underpinning community connection
As the disaster deepens, as the long emergency continues, there feels like a shift in artist practice from being maybe responsive and illustrating what is happening to actually trying to think about how we might need to connect as a community to help each other in that time of disaster. In 2017, we envisaged the increasing possibility of 5 consecutive days of heat over 40 degrees.
I think it's a much more direct and much more effective way of getting people involved and thinking about their own resilience and taking responsibility for themselves.
In 2018, we examined a pandemic event and wondered what happens when, through the risk of contagion, you would never bring people together to solve a big problem.
I'd like to demonstrate how quickly things can get out of hand.
Scientists can't be the only people to try and communicate science. The people who might not want to listen to an expert might very well be happy to hear the message from an artist. And so I found that quite powerful.
In 2019, we leap into a foreseeable future to consider the mass displacement of peoples from across the Pacific region and look at Australia's own history of displacement.
So we've been looking at what it means to be displaced, who's been displaced, including First Nations people of Australia, current people who are seeking asylum, and of course the future immigrants who will be forced to relocate as a result of climate change. We look to the Pacific, who are predominantly coastal communities, and from there I've offered this Tongan proverb, which is Piki Piki Hama Kai Vaiva Manava. It talks about the scarcity of resources. It talks about collectivism. It talks about becoming one and fair distribution of things that we need for our survival. It may even speak about the pain in giving.
And in the final year in 2020, we see the culmination of all 4 climate scenarios take over our city.
The most important thing is that it has thrown people back on the idea that your relationship with the people you live amongst is really important. Now, that mightn't sound straight away like a good preparation for a disaster, but in fact, in a disaster or a time of difficulty, who can you rely on? It might be a stranger who's in the street beside you, or it might be your next door neighbour, but it's the people around you. And this, through talk and imagination, was the idea that kept on popping up amongst people and leading them to reinforce their own confidence in each other.
So I've got a little bit confused in time, and you can see why. So I mentioned that video was made after our 2019 refuge program. We didn't know the pandemic was coming, so we thought that that we would be finishing it in 2020. And I've just been editing our final video for 2021, so I'm a little bit moving through time, like all of us. The pandemic has really squished those ideas, but I think you can see really profoundly, and especially in what Lorna Hannon says at the end, how refuge has worked in a very deep way to not just ask its participants from different disciplines to make to make art or be creative in response to climate change, but to actually situate themselves in a future where climate change has already occurred. And in taking that imaginative leap, we open up a lot of empathy, I think, and we open up a lot of connection. And I think the prescience of what Lorna says about the relationships that we have in our community being our greatest strength, the fact that she was recorded talking about that before COVID and now throughout last year as Melbourne suffered, and throughout now as people are suffering in Sydney and suffering all over the world, and it is exactly what Lorna describes that is becoming true. And I think what has been so interesting to us, as I said, Melbourne University is our knowledge partner for refuge, and they're doing some quite robust evaluation of the whole program now. But I think what's been quite clear to us is that in all the different participants, whether they're from emergency services or scientists or artists that were part of Refuge, all of those people, because they're engaged in a preparedness exercise for so long, they really have been able to work through this COVID-19 situation with far greater resilience and a far greater, sense of capacity, because they've been thinking about these ideas for a long time. So to that end, what that tells us as an observation for our program going forward is that the kinds of learnings that we have seen in Refuge, we want to embed across our work. And those learnings are they are very much centered about the centrality of First Nations wisdom. They are looking very much at how the arts works in partnership across disciplines. So the relationship we've built with particularly EMV and Red Cross and the SES, those have been very deep and reciprocal. And I think one of the quite, meaningful things that happened while our emergency service partners, particularly last year, were engaged in in recovery, in kind of response work to the COVID situation, was to see how they had the knowledge transfer of what good emergency practice looked like had occurred into artist practice. So artists were able to lead conversations quite differently to how they may have otherwise led them, and vice versa. So we are looking at a bunch of different ways that we can embed artists as part of, for example, Red Cross's ongoing work. And also looking at ways that we can embed artists as part of the City of Melbourne's emergency preparedness work. What else to say? I guess, I think that's probably, the kind of key learnings that we're doing at this point. But we are waiting on Melbourne University's broader kind of recommendations and reflections as well.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Emily. And I know various colleagues and myself that attended some of those refuge projects, they were extraordinary things to walk into and to be a part of. One of the things is that I found really extraordinary is how did you manage to bring so many different people from so many different backgrounds and different sectors together in the one room to look at this, and particularly thinking about emergency services who, they like their big machines and their lights and sirens, and I don't think art is necessarily a great sort of fit for a lot of those people. So how did that work?
Well, I think it is a little bit about finding the right collaborators within those institutions. So Faye Bendrips, who's the lead controller for the Footscray SES division, she is a performance artist herself. So she's played a fundamental leadership role, I think, in articulating and perhaps translating what we're doing. But people come from all walks of life, I think, as well. If I could have shown you the video we're working on from this year, we formed a partnership with the Williamstown Surf Lifesaving Club because one of the projects went from Altona all the way into the city. And I think one of them, they're not, that no one there has, I guess, an artistic language to understand what we're doing, but they absolutely understand the meaning and the purpose of what community preparedness for climate change really is. So I guess, it's a little bit about just like taking the time to find the right collaborators across disciplines. The other thing I would say is, I guess to describe the process that we would have gone through Refuge, it's not just about making events, I guess. So we bring, in the first instance, we bring together everybody in a lab, and that's people from all kinds of disciplines, all walks of life, and it's really, that lab is where we ask questions, and at the beginning of this project, it was all about playing in the dark. It was all about not knowing, and really exploring what it would mean to not work on artistic terms, not work on emergency services terms, not work on science terms, but find something in the middle. So I think emphasizing the unknowns and that we're all learning together is a very, I guess, a pretty important aspect.
That's a fantastic reflection, and I think certainly for me and my colleagues, one of the things that we got out of those experiences was making those connections with people, and really deep connections in some instances with people that you wouldn't ordinarily have because you were outside of the usual context. That's really fantastic. We're going to bring everybody back now. We've got about 10 minutes left for questions, and we've had some questions come through from our attendees, so thank you very much. The first question I'm going to put to Robin and Padma is around what is it that you've learnt through this experience in Malakuta with the bushfires last year and the work that you've been doing, and what is it you'd recommend to other communities or to communities in the future that might be facing similar tragedies?
Padma? I have an answer.
I guess in my writing, I'm talking about the very beginning and the relationship between emergency EM behaviours and the social component. And I think that we are talking in music and art, we're talking about the social component. So I would suggest, I submit that the disorganisation, reorganisation, the dissembling of the social and the cultural part of post-disaster is as important as the structural side. And that if we'd been, as you've all been suggesting, it's interesting about the Red Cross remark, by the way, that because they have such a gentle interface, and they are functioning in the volunteer space as well, for kind of interesting group to talk about, I think. But that's the area I talk about, nuance and subtlety. What was there before? Let's just start right there. Let's not invent. Let's just start right there. But anyhow, go on, Robin, if you've got something to add to that.
I am not a professional musician. I just play it for my own enjoyment. And the perspective I come to is to get instruments in people's hands and get them playing music together, so that it becomes the classic happy family. To play music together and find the right sort of music that everybody relates to is very critical. It gives people classical music when all they're interested in is 60s and 70s rock stuff, or to give people music that is just outside of their degree of interest or outside their ability to play is just not there. For recovery, the very first thing is to get people together, then to start getting them to socialise, and then getting them to forget and just immerse themselves in the music, and that's very important. And I think it's a great skill, but it needs people on the ground in the community who actually understand what it's like to live 6 hours away from Sydney and Melbourne. You know, the very last hour into Malakuta from Sydney and Melbourne, there is no mobile phone coverage. That's how remote it is. Millennials don't understand that, by the way. They wouldn't go to Malakuta. But to me, getting the instruments in there and getting people working, so sometimes they need help, sometimes it's leadership on the ground.
Really wise. Thank you, Robin and Padma. Really wise words and wise reflections from you both. And I think your comment, Padma, about starting with what's there, who was doing what, go and talk to them, build on those strengths. So thank you so much. Jo, we know that the arts sector has done it really tough over the past 18 months throughout the pandemic. It's one of those sectors that has been absolutely brought to its knees in some ways. How have you found artists and groups and people have adapted throughout this time?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, they've adapted in much the same as the rest of us in terms of learning to work on their practice or deliver their work from remotely. So some of the programs and some of the responses that we've seen through particularly COVID recovery support programs is that one of the upshots of the pandemic and the need to think differently has been people learning and sharing more about the way that they can participate in things like, recording music from home, for example, or participating in rehearsals across multiple sites. So there's definitely a component of that I think has been really fascinating to see how people have developed and evolved with it. I think one of the other upsides to it is that our colleagues at Arts Access Victoria will say that the opening up of more digital offerings to a lot of to audiences has been wonderful for the disability community who might not have been able to actually access those programs before. And so their refrain now is, don't ditch digital. If you're still doing that, if you've been able to set up the frameworks to do that work, keep with it. I mean, the comment that Robin made about no mobile coverage in Malakuta, there's also really poor internet coverage in a lot of places in regional Victoria as well. And some of those black spots, I think, have been exposed as needing urgent attention for creatives who are looking not just to download but upload their work. That's where the Wi-Fi problem is really the most acute. So there's some challenges there. So, I mean, some of those things have been really, it's been great to see people adapting in that way in the digital space. I would say there are limitations to it though, and there are art forms that better suit it than others. There are some that are going to take the recovery process is going to be a little bit longer. And there are some artists and creatives who have just made the decision that they're not able to at least professionally pursue that anymore because the uncertainty of opening and shutting and closing down is not something that they're going to be able to be maintained. So I think some of the long tail consequences of that is still to reveal themselves across the sector. But yeah, I mean, if I'm talking about the upside, there's definitely some things and some examples that we've seen of people who have been able to make that work more accessible and reach a wider audience because of the ability to and support to do it remotely.
Yeah, absolutely. We've all learned how to come together in really different ways, and let's hope that some of those ways stay with us so that we can be as accessible and inclusive as we can. Emily, I'm wondering what's next for Arts House. I know the Refuge program is winding up. I'm keen to know what's happening next.
It's a good question. The interesting and very profound thing about Refuge is that it's really co-owned by the community now. So it's not, even though I'm the artistic director, I don't feel like I can. It's not a project I can make a unilateral direction over, and I wouldn't feel ever comfortable to do that. So we have a lot of conversations to go, I think, to really go deep and understand how the Refuge program. I don't think it is going to end because we would be mad at this point to let go of a project that has built a very deep community and also deep knowledge of working through climate crisis. So instead, yeah, there's an evolution to occur, but I am a participant, like many others, in the journey of what that evolution looks like. So we will do a formal evaluation with partners and artists in August, and from there we'll start building out. But as the hints I see, or the sort of things that I'll be throwing into the mix are, I guess, ways that we can focus on the relationships that have been built through this program and start to embed them across Arts House's work. I think we were always a bit reluctant for the program to solely become about making events, because we do that very well, and what we're more interested in is how artists can be changed by scientists and emergency service workers, and how emergency service workers can be changed by artists. And I think that is a deeper, more kind of more ongoing kind of set of questions that Scotia's work absolutely addresses too. So I think those are the kinds of questions that we, with all the other kinds of people who own this work together, are thinking through.
Well, that's fantastic news. It sounds like something is going to continue along, and there'll be a lot of people cheering for that. So that's great news. We'll see what it is. Thanks, Emily. And Scotia, just some final reflections from you based on what you've seen and heard today, and anything else you wanted to share.
Yeah, sure. I think there's so much to unpack from all the presentations and all the wonderful work that's going on in a very small, localised level comparatively to a bigger one. But I think what we can maybe reiterate is that culture, particularly the First Nations culture, but culture more broadly, and arts engagement in its many breadths, has so much to offer. And I think one learning from COVID, maybe to add to what Jo has said, is that also artists have learned that they are part of communities in a much richer way than perhaps, and that they could apply their skills in a much richer way. So I think there's been a real learning in terms of our role as civic players and our importance. And I think the work of Refuge certainly has highlighted and continues to highlight the role that we need to play as social activists, and the role that arts and culture can play to highlight, to drive home, to create the emotional story that will bring people into a real need to act, and to act collectively. I think we can offer a whole raft of tools. I go back to that point you talked about of young people, and there's a lot of conversations that we're having currently around that idea of climate trauma, like young people experiencing this huge fear about their lives into the future, and how do we overcome that kind of feeling of lack or incapacity. And I think culture and the arts offer so many tools and different languages of how to unpack, and not to make it fearful, but a process of curiosity and sense of possibility, because otherwise it just becomes too hard. I think we can play in that space. We can play in the dark, as Refuge so clearly showed. And I think Jen Ray, who's one of the artists in Refuge, talks about this term of, we haven't done this before. No, collectively we haven't done this before. So it opens up the opportunity for us to play, and artists know how to play. We know about practice, and we know about curiosity and invention and engagement, and we've got a lot to offer, and we're hungry to come and play with you. So let's open up those opportunities and those sharings and collective kind of wisdom, so that we can do and be in that relationship of survival and strength.
Thank you, Scotia. And I couldn't agree with you more. I think it is so much about connections. It's about connecting with one another as artists, about connecting within our communities, and connecting across sectors to really strengthen our collective, I'm losing the word collective a lot, our collective resilience. I feel like we have only touched the edges of this conversation, and I wish we had another couple of hours to really more deeply explore some of the themes that have arisen today. I hope somebody takes the mantle and decides to pull together a really big and exciting event that focuses on the role of the arts and creativity in disaster recovery. Thank you all for coming along. A huge thank you to Scotia, Emily, Robin, Padma and Jo for making the time today to share in their expertise, their experience and their insights. A big thank you to our Auslan interpreters for their hard work in helping to make this event accessible. Thanks again to the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, and again, thank you all for coming along. We look forward to seeing you at the next VCOS Disaster Recovery Conversation, where we'll be discussing gender and disaster recovery. So thank you and good night.
Mm-hmm.